A Kenyan citizen, even a child born today, is indebted to a tune of 255,000, what is called debt per capita. Every Kenyan, Mr. Speaker, is indebted, let me repeat, to a tune of 255,000. When President Kibaki retired, Mr. Speaker, that debt per capita was just around 48,000 per every Kenyan. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we can see the trajectory. Let me give the actual statistics because I had some other pedestrian ones. And Mr. Speaker, anyone can go to the CBK website. You can find out that when President Kibaki retired, the debt load in this country, the debt portfolio, the combined domestic and foreign, was around 1.8 trillion. By the time we are wrapping up the 2017 calendar year, it was just around 4.5 trillion Kenya shillings. And therefore, the net borrowing in the first year of this regime was just around 2.7 trillion, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, from the handshake time, and these are the facts, from 2018 to date, that debt has accumulated to 11.7 trillion. And therefore, the net debt in the handshake era is actually 7.2 trillion Kenya shillings. Mr. Speaker, what you are asking, where is this money? We can see it, we cannot trace it. I also had some other people, Mr. Speaker, in this house, referencing other economies like Japan. And I want to respond with the real Japan. Mr. Speaker, I agree with those who are bringing or entertaining the arguments that countries borrow. And they said Japan. Actually, the actual Japan debt to GDP ratio is around 237%, which I agree is beyond the 100% of Kenya. But Mr. Speaker, that is so pedestrian because there are issues that we must look at very closely when we are talking about the issue of public debt. Number one is cost. Japan, Mr. Speaker, Japanese government is paid to borrow. What do I mean? The 10-year yield of a Japanese board, Mr. Speaker, Japanese government board, is actually negative earning, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, the government of Japan is actually paid to borrow. The same equivalent, the 10-year board of the government of Kenya, is in excess of 13%. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, there is actually nothing to compare. Number two, there is something called forex. Most of our debt that is foreign is dollar denominated. Mr. Speaker, our country has got over 5 trillion of foreign debt. Anytime there is a variation of only 1% of dollar to Kenya shilling, Mr. Speaker, our debt portfolio increases by over 50 billion. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we cannot compare Kenya and Japan or even with the US. But more importantly, there is something called net borrowing. When we talk about national public debt, we actually take the figure of the monies that the government has borrowed. In retrospect, Mr. Speaker, our country, Kenya, lets to no one. We only borrow. And I'm actually using the same site of Japan. The Japanese government, yes, they have borrowed in excess of 237%. But, Mr. Speaker, they have lent more money outside than they have borrowed. Actually, Japan is the highest net lender to the US government. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, the Japanese government actually makes money in borrowing to lend. And therefore, there is no comparison also there. Mr. Speaker, let me give you a citation of how much our country has borrowed and how much a proportion can actually do to the livelihood of the Kenyan people. The 7.2 trillion is borrowed by this regime from the handshake era. Mr. Speaker, just half of that, just around 3.56 trillion, can do the following. And I want the Kenyan people to listen carefully. The president always talks about the 10,000 kilometers of road tarmacked by this regime. If we actually double the 10,000 kilometers to 20,000 kilometers at a rate of 60 million, when we have even put in a cut for the brokers, 60 million per kilometer, that's around 1.2 trillion, Mr. Speaker. The Kenya National Bureau of Statistics gives us the data that Kenya has got 12 million households. When President Kibaki retired, 2 million of those had connection to electricity. Mr. Speaker, connecting the 10,000 remaining to electricity without even the government subsidy, and therefore we put it at 35,000, that is 350 billion, Mr. Speaker. If you are to connect the other 10,000 households to safe drinking water at 10 million households, Mr. Speaker, at 50,000 per household, that is around 500 billion, Mr. Speaker. If we are to build a level 5 hospital in every constituency in Kenya, that is 290 billion. Forget about the Tibet, Mr. Speaker. If we are to build a university of 1 billion Kenya shillings, if we add on even the SGR, Mr. Speaker, of 350 billion, that comes to below 3.5 trillion, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, what this borrowing has been perpetuating is something called development corruption. This government, led by those people in the highest offices, have captured our economy. Let me cite, for example, this expressway here. During President Kibaki's era, this expressway was to cost just around 25 billion. Currently, it's costing in excess of 80 billion, Mr. Speaker. Where is this money going? To pockets of some people. Let me also cite the SGR. We spent over 400 billion Kenyan taxpayers' money.
The Honorable Sotsi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity.